Dixie here. Today I want to talk to you about the differences in the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail now that I have completed a through hike on both of them. And no worries, I'm not like taking sides or anything yet. Now this is going to be a brief overview video. I want to, touch on as many aspects of each trail as I can, but know that I am going to do more detailed videos about these specific topics on the Pacific Crest Trail, and I have likely done them already on the Appalachian Trail. So you can check the older videos for these topics if you want to hear more about them. Before I get started, I want to explain to you my perspective so that you understand where my opinions are coming from on these matters and why I might have seen what I saw. So in 2015, I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail heading northbound, and in 2017, I thru-hiked the Pacific Crest Trail heading northbound also. The year that I hiked the AT was a pretty normal year, except for it was pretty rainy when I got to Maine. We called it the Maine-soon that came through Maine because there was so much rain. And on the Pacific Crest Trail, it was a record high snow year in the Sierra Nevada. So the rivers were raging and there was just so much more snow than what is seen in a normal year. So I do want those things to be understood moving forward. So just to give you a little background information on both trails, the Appalachian Trail is the older of the two trails, and it runs from Springer Mountain, Georgia, all the way to Mount Katahdin in Maine. It passes through 14 different states and spans 2,189 miles depending on the year. The Pacific Crest Trail is a little bit longer. It spans 2,650 miles from basically Mexico to Canada, through California, Oregon, and Washington. The Appalachian Trail was completed in 1937, while the Pacific Crest Trail was deemed a scenic trail in like 1968, but it wasn't actually officially completed until 1993. So the Appalachian Trail has nearly 60 years on the Pacific Crest Trail as far as being a completed long-distance trail. Now for discussing elevation, the highest point on the Appalachian Trail is 6,643 feet, and that's at Clingman's Dome in Tennessee. It's actually the state high point also. And then on the Pacific Crest Trail, you're at over double that, over 13,000 feet on Forester Pass in the Sierra Nevada. Now while that sounds crazy, that it's that different, and it seems like, oh my goodness, and on the PCT you must be like straight up and straight down, and it's actually quite the opposite. The Appalachian Trail is known for being like a roller coaster. You go straight up the mountain to a peak just to go straight down and, do it all again. The Pacific Crest Trail, you kind of, if I want to say ridge walk, more so than on the Appalachian Trail. So when you gain elevation, you kind of tend to stay there. There are climbs. I mean, you're still hiking mountains, but the Pacific Crest Trail is graded for livestock, so a lot of people ride horses out there, while the Appalachian Trail is a footpath only, basically. So, there are places on the Appalachian Trail where you're hand over hand climbing, and there's nothing like that on the Pacific Crest Trail in a normal year. So even though the Pacific Crest Trail is longer than the Appalachian Trail, it actually usually takes people less time to do the PCT than the AT. And even though I took way more zeros on the Pacific Crest Trail, I still finished it in less time than it took me to finish the Appalachian Trail. I think that a lot of this is because the grade of the trail allows you to do more miles. It's not as strenuous, it's not as physically challenging. So you do get the miles knocked out faster, and most people's daily mileage is higher on the Pacific Crest Trail than the Appalachian Trail. I mean, if you look at me, I maxed out in 24 hours the most miles I could do, and on the PCT I did 62 miles in a 24-hour period, while on the Appalachian Trail the most I ever did in a 24-hour period was 33 miles. Now that is not to say that the Pacific Crest Trail is easy. It's just that I think it's less physically demanding, so you're able to do more miles in a day than on the Appalachian Trail. One of the biggest questions I've received is, how is water on the Pacific Crest Trail? Is it as bad as they say? Is it really way worse than the AT? There is so much water on the Appalachian Trail. It's very plentiful. There are a few areas that, maybe in New York it got a little dry, but for the most part there was water every, 5 miles at most. It is definitely not that way on the Pacific Crest Trail, especially in the desert. This was a wetter year, so we were more fortunate with more frequent water sources, but that isn't always the case. You do have longer carries. You are going to have to carry more water. Now, the water sources, are in existence on the PCT. You're not going to be without water. A lot of times people will cache, put water caches out, so especially real dry stretches. So there was like a 40 to 50 mile stretch at the end of the desert that had no water sources on trail. You could walk, extra miles off of the trail to a water source, but nobody likes to do off-trail miles. There are trail angels who keep water stocked at the caches, and you know, regardless of either trail, you get word way ahead of time what the situation with the water is, from section hikers, people who are ahead of you posting on social media, whatever. You'll know the situation, especially if you have the gut hooks app on either trail. So water is not something to freak out about on either of these trails. Don't let that be a deal breaker for you. But you know, it is a concern, and yes, there is considerably less water on the PCT in certain stretches. As far as resupply goes, for the most part, your mileage between resupply points is going to be a little higher on the Pacific Crest Trail, on average, not, you know, every stretch necessarily. But on the Appalachian Trail, it seemed like every 3 to 5 days I was crossing a road where I could go into town. I didn't go into like every single town that I possibly could on the AT. On the Pacific Crest Trail, it's much more defined. You know, you're pretty much going to have to go in when you get the opportunity. Again, not always that way, but in general, when you get to a road, you're gonna go into town. And so I would say the average on the PCT is more like 5 to 7 days. But with both trails, you can be in town in about 5 days if you so choose. One thing that I did notice that was different on the PCT is that when you're going to town, getting hitches take a little bit longer. There's generally a little less traffic, depending on the road, of course, but not as many people are familiar with the PCT and what's going on with it as the AT. And also the trail communities along the AT are just stronger in general, and it's more like people wanting to help people. But again, it's an older trail, it's been established longer. The PCT is getting there though, but it is noticeably different. So also the hitches into town are usually longer as far as distance from the trail to the town that you're going to resupply in. The Appalachian Trail is a lot of times pretty close to towns, 10 miles or less, and on the PCT it's not abnormal to have, you know, 10-mile plus hitches, and then sometimes even 2-part hitches. So you'll have like a turnoff, you'll be on one main highway and you'll have a turnoff, you know, to go on another highway to get to the town you're trying to get to. So you may, you know, get to experience 2 different hitches, but it's cool. You get to meet more people along the way. Weather. On the Appalachian Trail, it was very common to get rained on. It was normal. On the Pacific Crest Trail, I got a light sprinkling while in California, and then the rest of it, I maybe had one day in Oregon where it rained a little bit, and then several days where I got sleeted on and snowed on in Washington, which that's normal for the Pacific Northwest, right? But certainly way more days of precipitation on the Appalachian Trail. In general, the temperatures on the Appalachian Trail are expected, so I never had, you know, a crazy cold snap or anything like that. On the Pacific Crest Trail, I did experience that. In the desert, I had been sweating, I had been taking siestas, you know, to just stay out of the sun and having a night hike more in the desert. And then I was about to send my warm layers home, or at least ahead, to where I expected it would get cold again. And I'm so glad that I did not do that, because before I knew it, there was a snap and I was like freezing the last few days of the desert. So, I mean, it can change so quickly out there, of course, at higher elevations. So I would say that weather is a little scarier on the Pacific Crest Trail in the way that you don't necessarily know what to expect temperature-wise, and you kind of have to be prepared for anything at any time. I was never without my warm bases, whereas on the Appalachian Trail during the summer I slept in shorts and a tank top, you know. But on the Pacific Crest Trail, sure, there were some warm nights, but I would just sleep in like my sports bra and underwear or whatever. But I never got rid of my leggings and my warm top. So of course there are some differences in gear. You need more specialized equipment for the Pacific Crest Trail. If you go out on the Appalachian Trail with the wrong gear, you can correct your mistakes pretty quickly. I mean, even going southbound through the 100-mile wilderness, there are exit points. I would pay more attention to what you need if you're going to go southbound on the Appalachian Trail. But if you start a no-bow through hike on the AT, I don't know, I just know so many people who had no idea what they were doing, and like they still survived, and a lot of them even still finished their through hikes. So I think the Appalachian Trail allows for more error, whereas the Pacific Crest Trail is a little more brutal in the way that it's not so forgiving. So I'm not saying that, you know, it'll be a total detriment to, you know, your life if you don't have exactly the right things. On the PCT, it is recommended that you have a bear can and a micro spikes and an ice axe in the Sierra Nevada, where on the AT you really don't have to worry about that for the most part. There are areas where they recommend having a bear canister, but you can just not camp in those areas. And like I said, you know, for the PCT, you definitely don't want to be without some warm weather gear. Hammocking versus tenting. So I think for the most part, you can really do either on either trail. I think with more trees on the Appalachian Trail, it's obvious that it might be easier to find a better setup than on the Pacific Crest Trail. But I do know people who hammocked the whole PCT, and you know, with the lack of rain, you can cowboy camp if you need to, if you can't find trees to set up. But I think that, you know, there are little patches of trees here and there, even in the desert, that if you were really set on hammocking, you could make it happen. But for sure, hammocking is more common on the Appalachian Trail than the Pacific Crest Trail. Dogs on the trail. So I didn't see quite as many dogs on the Pacific Crest Trail, but I did see some, so people do take their dogs out there. I did a video with a girl who had her dog out on the Appalachian Trail, so I might do the same thing with my friend Milestone, who hiked with her dog Ragnar on the Pacific Crest Trail. So everyone always talks about how the Appalachian Trail has way more people on it, right? Well, in 2016, 4,006 people were actually recorded at some point as doing a through hike, whether northbound, southbound, flip-flopping, and all of that. And those are people who are actually on the trail. 947 reported completing the trail, which is a 23% success rate or completion rate for the AT. And just so you know, 12% of the people who were reported, you know, on the trail through hiking were southbounders. Now, for the PCT in 2016, so the same year, 3,500 people requested a permit. A lot of times the PCTA reports people who request permits don't ever actually show up on the trail, so it's likely that there were less than 3,500 people, but not necessarily everybody who is out there through hiking got a permit, right? I mean, not everyone follows like what you're suggested or supposed to do. So I don't know exactly how many people you would say were actually out there through hiking. Even if all 3,500 were out there, you know, it's still 500 less than what were reported on the AT. 711 people said they finished the trail in 2016, which means that 20% of the 3,500 completed the trail, but again, not necessarily all of those 3,500 were out there. And 9% of the people who registered as southbounders. So yes, the Appalachian Trail could have, you know, anywhere from 500 to 1,000, potentially more people on the trail. And speaking of people, I would definitely say that the culture on the Appalachian Trail is much different than the Pacific Crest Trail. The Appalachian Trail, I feel like, has a lot more camaraderie. Tramilies, you know, trail families are certainly more prevalent. And, you know, I think a lot of that has to do with the shelters and the shelter logbooks. So on the Appalachian Trail, they have 3-sided structures known as shelters, and you can stay in them or camp around them. And a lot of people gather at those places because they typically have a privy or a pit toilet, the shelter, a water source, and a firing. So people like to gather up and, you know, just tell stories about the day, share their experiences. And a lot of people still hike alone on the Appalachian Trail, so it's not like you have to be or you will be around people all the time. It's really up to you. And if you don't want to be around people, you just don't camp at one of the shelters. You can go, you know, camp somewhere else. Now on the Pacific Crest Trail, there really are no shelters. You have your random, you know, little old log cabin or, you know, shelter, like bad weather shelters and things like that, emergency shelters. But it's not common at all to see shelters. I can probably count on 2 hands, maybe even 1, the number of, you know, structures that you can sleep in on the Pacific Crest Trail. So I think that that affects the culture a lot. Also, you know, logbooks on the PCT are not as common. It's almost more often that you see those in town, and by then you have service on your phone and, you know, you're already communicating with people that way. But on the AT, it's fun to get to a shelter and check in with the shelter logbook and see, you know, when your friends were there, or how many days ago so-and-so passed through, or just to get, you know, news about what's going on. And it's almost like a social media of the trail. And people on the Pacific Crest Trail tend to camp a lot more scattered out. So some of the water sources, you know, if you haven't had a water source in a decent stretch, then you might have people that camp together at a water source, but people get so used to dry camping, so camping somewhere where there isn't a water source, that it's not a big deal to them to camp near water. And I think that it's more of an issue for people who have through hiked the Appalachian Trail previously. They tend to huddle up near the water sources because they don't like the idea of, you know, being without a water source in case you knock your water over or something leaks or whatever. So I think that it's not just that the people are nicer on the Appalachian Trail than the Pacific Crest Trail, but it's more set up for that trail community, whereas the PCT is a lot more kind of, fend for yourself. So even though there are no shelters for the most part along the Pacific Crest Trail, you do still find your occasional privy or pit toilet. Perk will definitely vouch for the fact that the Appalachian Trail has way more privies than the Pacific Crest Trail, because he plays this strange game with himself where he sees how long, when he first starts the thru hike, he can go without taking a poop in the woods. So he lost a lot quicker on the Pacific Crest Trail, I think, than on the Appalachian Trail. As far as trail magic goes, there certainly is a lot more trail magic on the Appalachian Trail. Again, more roads intersect with it. It's easier to set up trail magic. The community following the Appalachian Trail is a lot bigger. So of course you're going to have more, trail angels and people who want to be involved. But I do not mean to sell short the people on the Pacific Crest Trail who are trail angels. There are definitely some amazing, what I call fixed trail angels, so the ones that are known to be at certain locations along the Pacific Crest Trail. But as far as like the random acts of just generosity and things like that, it certainly isn't as common on the Pacific Crest Trail as on the Appalachian Trail. Something else that goes along with the whole community is trail names. I noticed on the Appalachian Trail that people tended to get a trail name a lot quicker, and it's kind of seen more seriously on the AT. So once I became Dixie, I was not like, oh, my name is Dixie. Well, I mean, it's Jessica, but I guess they call me Dixie out here. No, it's not that at all on the Appalachian Trail. On the Appalachian Trail, it is, I am Dixie. My rat race name is Jessica, or my, synthetic world name is Jessica, but I am Dixie. But on the Pacific Crest Trail, people are a lot more hesitant. Also, I noticed that it's several hundred miles at times before people ever earn their trail name. And so, I don't know, they don't stick as much. I think by the end it's, more accepted and people don't act so like off about it. The leave no trace principles for the Appalachian Trail versus the Pacific Crest Trail are pretty similar. I will say that where you can and cannot have fires is a little more strict on the Pacific Crest Trail, and rightly so, because they experience, a lot of wildfires, and so you have to pay attention, is a chance for wildfire high, how windy is it, am I in an exposed area? Whereas on the Appalachian Trail, it's much harder for me to think of where you shouldn't or aren't permitted to have fires. And even though you're permitted to have fires on the Pacific Crest Trail, you really should use common sense because a lot of the fires that they've experienced out there have been from carelessness. So just because you can doesn't always mean that you should out there. Whereas on the Appalachian Trail, anytime we had a fire, I never felt like we were going to burn the forest down. And then the bathroom thing, the rules again are pretty much the same, except on the Pacific Crest Trail they do ask you to pack out your toilet paper, while the Appalachian Trail says that it's okay, to dig your 6-inch cat hole and bury the toilet paper. On the Pacific Crest Trail though, especially like in the desert, you just don't have the same soil microbes that can break down toilet paper as quickly, as the soil on the Appalachian Trail. It's just basically two different worlds. So speaking of the desert and then like the lushness of the Appalachian Trail, that is something that is very, very different, especially if you start going northbound. So the Pacific Crest Trail is almost like several different trails. You go from the desert into the High Sierra, into Northern California, which is different than the rest of it, into Oregon and Washington, and it's just something different, in each of those regions. Whereas the Appalachian Trail, from Georgia to Maine, you're pretty much always in what they call the Green Tunnel. And, there are areas that are exposed and you do experience some different terrains, but for the most part, it is forested. And I know a lot of people think that that means that the Appalachian Trail is not beautiful, and that is false. So the Appalachian Trail, the lushness of the forest was just amazing. Anytime that it rained, things just got even more vibrant and green and beautiful. And there were all these little critters that would come out when it rained, and just, for somebody who likes to see the up close things like the bugs and the critters and the flowers, and, you just see nature thriving there. Where you go to the desert, and although you can see out and it's much more beautiful than I ever expected it could be, it's definitely not that, healthy forest feel. It's much more barren and just, kind of like you think a desert would be. It's very, almost brutal. The things you see on the desert, they're not like, oh, soft flower petals. It's like, cactus, and, so, I mean, it's just two different worlds. But again, it's not desert the whole you know, Pacific Crest Trail. But I'll tell you, what green tunnel you do get on the Pacific Crest Trail, you'll really appreciate, because you don't realize how much the trees block you from the wind and the sun and the rain. So a concern of a lot of people who plan to do through hikes are bugs and wildlife. So the Appalachian Trail has a lot of bugs, has a good bit of wildlife, and you see a lot of the same things on the Pacific Crest Trail, you know, squirrels and birds and yada yada. But I will say that the amount of rattlesnakes that I saw on the AT versus the PCT is crazy. So on the Appalachian Trail, I saw one rattlesnake in the state of Pennsylvania, and they're protected there. On the Pacific Crest Trail, I saw 10 rattlesnakes, and all of them in the state of California. Now, there are also a lot of crazy looking little critters in the desert. You've got scorpions and like the centipedes and just, you know, wild things. I also saw the biggest salamander I've ever seen in Washington. But now, all of those things are cool to me. I really enjoy seeing those. There are apparently tarantulas in the desert in California that I missed out on those. I didn't get to see them. The Appalachian Trail does have these little red F's that I didn't see on the Pacific Crest Trail, and I really miss seeing them. As far as bigger wildlife goes, I saw 7 black bears on the Appalachian Trail and only 4 on the Pacific Crest Trail. I guess there is like a very slight chance that you could see a grizzly on the Pacific Crest Trail, but I think that that is very uncommon and very unlikely. Some people have reported seeing mountain lions. I didn't get to see any on the Pacific Crest Trail. I was actually hoping that I would see one. You don't have to worry about that on the Appalachian Trail. I saw moose on the Appalachian Trail. On the PCT, no moose, only elk. And I know on the Appalachian Trail everyone freaks out about ticks, but I only saw like one crawling up my pants leg and like one on my pack. I mean, I think I saw 2 the whole time, and neither one of them was attached to me. And on the Pacific Crest Trail, I never saw a tick. So overall, as far as critters and wildlife goes, sure, I guess there could be more scarier sightings on the Pacific Crest Trail than on the Appalachian Trail. But honestly, that's part of it. Like, that's part of being in the woods. That's part of the adventure, and you know, you just never know what's going to be around the next corner, and that's really exciting. So expenses. Which trail is cheaper to hike? Costs seem to be higher out on the West Coast than the East Coast. The cheapest place that I ever spent time in was the South. So in the Southeast on the Appalachian Trail, it's more affordable than once you get up north. But still, even those areas are cheaper than what I experienced out on the Pacific Crest Trail. It's not like a huge difference, and I have not calculated my own personal expenses yet for the Pacific Crest Trail, but I will do that, and I will have that information, like my cost analysis, laid out in my ebook that I am going to do for the Pacific Crest Trail, like I did for the Appalachian Trail, which will be just kind of like a guide and planning, like a how-to prepare for the Pacific Crest Trail. But in just, observation, I can say that staying in towns was a lot more expensive on the Pacific Crest Trail than the Appalachian Trail. The cost of food in towns and groceries and things just seemed to be a little higher. But say it costs you $1,000 a month on the Appalachian Trail if you're not like too strict on yourself. The Pacific Crest Trail might be, this is me throwing out a number, it might be $1,200 a month, to $1,500 a month for the same level of comfort. But if you hike the Pacific Crest Trail in, 5 months where it took you 6 months on the Appalachian Trail, then the costs might, average out a little bit. But I will do a video that details more of the cost breakdown on the Pacific Crest Trail at a later time. Alright, so the mental versus physical challenge. I think that I have, made it pretty clear that in general, the Appalachian Trail is a more physically challenging trail than the Pacific Crest Trail, while the Pacific Crest Trail to me was more mentally challenging. And I can't really, put my thumb on what made it that way for me. I guess, obviously my body hurt in general less on the Pacific Crest Trail than the Appalachian Trail. So, I mean, the physical part is pretty easy, but through hiking in general is more mind over matter than anything, especially in the Sierra Nevada, and that's where it's it's hard for me to, I guess, be fair to the Pacific Crest Trail, but there were a couple of times where I really thought that I might not make it out of the Sierra Nevada, and I never really experienced that on the Appalachian Trail, and again, I don't think that that's normal for the PCT. I have known people that have completed the Appalachian Trail and then did the PCT and were like, oh, it's easy, it's nothing. But I can tell you, for me this year, the Pacific Crest Trail wasn't nothing. I think that maybe because there is less camaraderie and for me there was less, tramley experience on the Pacific Crest Trail, maybe that is what made it's so much more of a mental challenge than anything. And just knowing that you are in more isolated areas, things do seem more barren, you are more at the mercy of the elements because a lot of the trail is much more exposed. I think that all of that weighed into it, stressing out about water more, because the water sources are further apart, stressing out more about the food. Have I packed enough food? Have I packed too much food? And having to wait longer periods to correct your gear and things like that. I think that those things weighed heavier on my mind, which of course would increase the mental challenge of the whole experience. One thing that probably also helps keep the morale high on the Appalachian Trail is that you're going through, like I said, 14 different states. So you have all these little mile markers, and even though, at times the Appalachian Trail kind of looks the same, because I said from Georgia until Massachusetts, goodness, it still looks like Georgia, but the fact that you get to cross all of these state lines is just encouraging. Where on the Pacific Crest Trail, even though the terrain looks and feels different, throughout the journey, it takes forever to get through California. You're never gonna get there. But of course, I went into the Pacific Crest Trail with, the memories of how it was on the Appalachian Trail. So maybe for people who thru-hike the PCT for the first time, that's not such an annoying thing. But I will say crossing the state lines on the PCT means a whole lot more. And maybe because you're so sore on the Appalachian Trail that you just don't care about anything else, I don't know. But I think for the most part, if you ask people who have done both trails, they will tell you that the Appalachian Trail is more physical while the Pacific Crest Trail is certainly more mental. Cell service. So maybe this ties in partially to why the PCT is a little more mentally stressful. There is less service on the Pacific Crest Trail than the Appalachian Trail, for at least Verizon carriers. So on the Appalachian Trail, pretty much every day, if not, then certainly every other day, I could get some form of communication out. Whereas on the PCT, it was not like that. At the beginning, there's pretty good service through the desert, but towards the end in Washington and places in Oregon, it's pretty spotty. And in the Sierra Nevada, it's almost non-existent. So it's certainly more common to go a few days without being able to get in touch with people, which is a little stressful. If you're worried about what's going on at home, or you just want to vent to somebody about what's going on, and you happen to be alone at the time, or for whatever reason. So that probably does tie in to why the Pacific Crest Trail might be a little more stressful. So the start and finish line, I have to say that I don't know, I think that the Appalachian Trail takes the cake on this one. So the starting point being at Springer Mountain, it's not as exciting as Mount Katahdin up north in Maine, but it is still, like summiting some point. Whereas on the Pacific Crest Trail, you just kind of walk up to this monument in the desert and you're like, well, I'll be darned, there it is, But I have to say that the ending in on the Canadian border was especially exciting for me because I had never been in another country before. So getting to, walk from the border of one country through my country to the border, of the other one, it was just kind of a neat experience. But again, the monument is nothing to really, get real excited about. Whereas like the sign on Mount Katahdin was just something that was like, I don't know, you had to fight this huge mountain, for 5 miles or so to get to the top, and after your 2,000 almost 200 mile journey. So I think that if you do a no-bow hike or even a SOBO one on the Appalachian Trail, that you're going to have much more of like an epic finish than you will on the Pacific Crest Trail. Purism. So for some of y'all, you're like, what in the world is purism? What do you mean? Well, if you are on the Appalachian Trail or any long distance trail around thru-hikers, you'll hear people say to each other like, are you a purist? Or, well, I'm not a purist. So basically, to complete a thru-hike of any trail, it means completing all of the miles of that trail within a 12-month period. But there are certain levels of purity in completing these trails. So the Appalachian Trail, it's very black or white. You may have like alternate paths and things like that, but if you want to be considered a purist, you stay on the Appalachian Trail and pass only white blazes, and you don't take any of those like alternate routes. Whereas on the Pacific Crest Trail, there are things that you don't want to miss out on. So like at Crater Lake, the Rim Trail is an alternate. There's an alternate that goes up to Mount San Jacinto, and there end up being fire closures and things like that. So it's impossible to do every single foot of the Pacific Crest Trail in a year, pretty much at this point. But that doesn't mean that you're not a through hiker, because you can do every single like open mile of trail. You're just not, you know, you're reaching a level of purity isn't as crystal clear and black and white as it is on the Appalachian Trail. So that is hard for a lot of people who consider themselves purists on the Appalachian Trail to go over to the PCT and then be like, what do you mean I can't do every mile of it? What do you mean there's a closure, you know? So that is a big difference between the two trails. You know, it's not common that a section of the Appalachian Trail is closed, whereas on the Pacific Crest Trail, it's not common that you have a year where there's not a section closed. And that fact nearly drove me crazy. So what I did was just to make sure that I hiked every single mile of open trail. And some people on the Pacific Crest Trail, because it's a journey from, you know, Mexico to Canada, they consider being a purist connecting footprints. But sometimes the fastest way to, you know, get around a closure is going to cut off some open miles of trail. And so it's really just something that you end up having to decide for yourself while you're out there and, you know, trying to understand, like, what does this hike mean to you? I talked to a lady who is working on her second Triple Crown this year while I was on the PCT, and you know, I asked her, I was like, which of the 3 trails is your favorite? I have to ask. And she said, when somebody asks you, do you want the mountains or the ocean, you know, why can't we just have them both? And she said that each trail has its own charms and its own beauty, and she's right. She is absolutely correct. And you know, even if I went back to the Appalachian Trail and through hiked it again, it's not going to be the same experience. It's never going to be the same as it was. So you just have to go, wow, that was a great experience. Now let's try something else, you know? So in a nutshell, the Appalachian Trail for me was just a magical experience. There is just so much history there, and you know, you see it as you go through and you experience it, and it's just something that I can't describe, and you have to go out and see for yourself. The communities are stronger and more closely knit, and like I said, there's just more camaraderie and teamwork, and it's not so much about vast beauty as it is, you know, stopping to smell the roses right directly in front of you and enjoying the small things. But the Pacific Crest Trail is, you know, more wild. It's less established, less controlled. You know, it's more volatile and more exciting and more adventurous, I guess. A through hike in general is adventurous, but it's just got that, you know, going out west wild feel to it. So it really boils down to what kind of adventure you're in the market for. I met people on the Pacific Crest Trail who it was their first backpacking trip, just like, you know, the Appalachian Trail was my first backpacking trip ever. So I don't think that for either through hike that previous backpacking experience is necessary. I think that there is more room for error on the Appalachian Trail. Sure, it might make you feel more comfortable if you've had test runs with your, you know, gear and things like that. But it's all about what adventure you are seeking for yourself. But I will say that if I had to re-hike at this point, the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail again, I guess I am picking sides, but like the AT, you know, my heart and soul are with the AT. I feel like the AT gave me soul and life, and the Pacific Crest Trail tried to like steal my soul and life, you know. But that's not to say that the finish line wasn't sweeter because of, you know, the more difficult challenges that I was faced with. To be fair, you know, the Appalachian Trail was my first through hiking experience, and just like your first love or anything, you know, your first car or whatever, you're always going to have a stronger bond with that memory because it was the first, you know. So I don't know. I wonder if people who have hiked the Pacific Crest Trail first in a normal year that go and then hike the Appalachian Trail, if they feel you know, that love with the PCT like I do with the AT. So I don't know, because I can't unknow what I know. I've talked a lot about how these trails differ, but the fact is, on either trail, you still stink, you're still homeless, and you know, you're still gonna have an amazing adventure with awesome people. It's still going to be a life-changing experience, whichever you do. So the point is, go for it. You know, if you're thinking about doing a through hike, I think either trail you're going to be absolutely amazed with, and it will really teach you something about yourself. Well, I hope that y'all enjoyed this information, and that maybe if some of y'all are trying to decide, you know, which trail you'd like to through hike first, that it maybe helps you make that decision. But if you do have questions about, you know, one trail versus the other in a certain aspect that I didn't cover, please feel free to ask that in the comments below. I will go, you know, deeper into some of these details on the certain aspects before I get out there on the CDT. So y'all be on the lookout for that. And with that, we will see y'all next time.